I want to switch gears now and talk about AI. It is center stage in Washington today, with OpenAI CEO Sam Altman testifying before the Senate Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law about the challenges and need for standards surrounding the rapidly developing technology. Joining us now for Insight is Kyle Wiggers, a senior reporter who covers AI at TechCrunch. Kyle, thanks for joining us. Let's get right into this and talk about, first, what was your initial takeaway from today's testimony?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Today's testimony covered a range of topics, for sure. It included Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which created the viral chatbot ChatGPT, which I'm sure many of your viewers have heard of. Also participating was IBM Chief Privacy and Trust Officer Christina Montgomery and Gary Marcus, a former NYU professor and expert in these types of AI systems. They all spoke to the dangers of these systems and the need to regulate them. They weren't always aligned on how to do that, which is telling, I think, because these systems are evolving so quickly. It's hard to predict, and several lawmakers got out at this point, what AI systems are going to look like in even the next few months to year. One idea that did emerge that found some consensus among regulators and those participating in the panel was the idea of an agency that would have the power to give companies a license to deploy their AI and revoke that license if it turns out that they're deploying that AI in maybe an unsafe way or not implementing sufficient safeguards. Altman especially was supportive of this notion and urged lawmakers to adopt some form of it in the future if they so chose to do so.
The approach that we have seen from many tech executives who've testified over the years about regulation is to say, sort of, look, we're ready for it, regulate us. And we sort of took Sam Altman kind of took the same approach today, talking about what that should look like. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I think the U.S. should lead here and do things first, but to be effective, we do need something global. Given what it takes to make these models, the chip supply chain, the sort of limited number of competitive GPUs, the power the US has over these companies, I think there are paths to the US setting some international standards that other countries would need to collaborate with and be part of that are actually workable, even though it sounds on its face like a impractical idea. And I think it would be great for the world.
So, Kyle, a few things on that. I mean, number one, to Sam's comment there about how the U.S. should act first. I mean, the U.S. is already behind when you look at the EU, sort of, at least in draft form, pushing forward what that AI legislation would look like. But in your conversations that you're having, what are you hearing about what that ultimate regulation should look like, given that this is not something that necessarily has borders? And if you take a fragmented approach, enforcement could be really difficult.
Right, that's true. It's unclear, I mentioned the possibility of an agency being formed to regulate this. What form that agency might take and exactly what their purview might be. There's so many problems that have yet to be resolved around AI, especially generative AI, the kind of AI that can create text and images given a brief prompt. For one, there are data privacy concerns, right? How should companies go about training their AI on data that might be copyrighted or private? That's still being hashed out, and it's unclear what steps Congress might take, if any, to resolve that issue. Then there are questions about copyright. Speaking of whether the output of these systems can be copyrighted. The U.S. Copyright Office hasn't really decided or made it clear in what circumstances you might be able to own a piece of AI-generated artwork or writing. So there are just myriad issues at play here, and I think that's why we've seen kind of limited to no action on the congressional side. The EU is doing its best to attempt to establish a framework, and perhaps whatever happens here will follow that framework to some degree. But again, it's an evolving issue, and it's really hard to regulate something that's such a fast-moving target. Clearly, though, this panel illustrated the strong desire from both industry and lawmakers to take some action.
So, Kyle, there's been some conversation on social media about where Congress is in terms of the cycle. And, like, let's say you compare this to social media and dealing with the issues that have come up in social media and, say, regulation around that. Do you feel like Congress is at the starting point, or are they already behind when it comes to dealing with regulating AI?
I think it's fair to say that they're behind. Then again, I'm not sure who is ahead, if anyone. The EU hasn't adopted the AI Act, the AI framework that has been in the works over there for quite some time now, years, and we won't see it go into effect for who knows. It's indeterminable. Several lawmakers involved in the panel today mentioned the fact that maybe Congress has been slow moving on this, especially as it's beginning to trickle into the real world and affect people and perhaps even eliminate jobs, albeit create new ones, depending on who you believe. No, there is a belief, I think, among many lawmakers, and not just in the U.S., that regulation has to come into effect. But there's a lot of debate over whether that regulation means the creation of a new agency, or it means total restrictions on certain types of AI that might be dangerous. For example, AI that might put out misinformation into the world, especially around elections. I think Altman mentioned that during the panel. That's one of his bigger fears about AI. Go ahead.
To what extent has Europe already set the standard, though? I mean, isn't so much of this about who comes out first in creating a regulation and sort of the U.S. being able to build on that?
Right. I think the EU has provided an excellent framework, in fact. I'm no expert on the intricacies of that framework, but I do know that it categorizes AI into safer forms of AI that then are regulated more lightly, and more harmful types of AI potentially, including AI that might be used to decide whether or not a person receives a loan. That would be regulated a bit more closely, and there would be more restrictions around how that sort of AI could be used. I personally believe that laws here would do well to follow some of what the EU is proposing. As for the creation of an agency like Altman and some lawmakers today proposed, I don't think we have enough details to say whether or not that's a good idea. The ideas floated today were very high level and lacking in the sort of detail that's necessary to determine whether or not that's a good decision. I expect this will be the first panel of several to come touching on this topic.
All right, Kyle Wiggers, the real Kyle, and not an AI of TechCrunch. Thanks so much for joining us today.